doesn't like values. Science calls values bias. So if a scientist states a personal opinion, then it taints the information that they provide from their own. Evaluation has its foundations in social science and particularly agricultural research. So coming from that scientific background, evaluators don't like to have values. We talk about the independence of the evaluator and the evaluator being free from values. And so what I'm going to talk about is how those values actually exist and how, if we acknowledge them, we actually reduce bias and we can also improve our practice of evaluation and the results that we achieve. So most of you guys are involved at some point in time, I imagine, in writing evaluation briefs or research briefs. So if you think of the process you go about doing that, you're developing objectives or questions that a contractor will measure. So from my point of view as a contractor, one of the first things I see is a brief that might have, for example, 10 evaluation questions on it. The first point where my values come in is how I allocate my budget against those evaluation questions. So standard government contracts, say 100k, 10 questions, 10k a question, or do I think some questions are worth more because they're more important, or are they harder to measure? So I determine, before I've even spoken to a client, I'm just writing a proposal now, I determine what merit things will have. So there might be a question on cost, or I might think that's particularly important. My background is, as you just heard, is a little bit financial. So I might decide I'll give that 30,000. So I've made a value judgment about how important those questions are to the client before I've even started, before I've even been commissioned. Then on the next point, selecting a method. So I mentioned cost, but again, my values will come in now in terms of how I think cost should be measured. So am I going to be looking at cost benefit? Will I do a microeconomic analysis? Will I do some forensic accounting? Will I look at administrative program costs? Will I look at the cost of delivering a unit of service? Or am I sick of numbers today? And instead I'll just talk to people about how they go about managing costs. So how do they go about setting the budget? How do they go about procurement? Do the program managers think the service offers value for money? What do consumers think of it? So I could go either very quant or I could go either very qual, and that would depend on how I value those different methods, which is the next point, weighting. So usually in the evaluation we're using mixed method designs. I think in Ipsos most of our recent methods probably have maybe 10 different parts to them. And we could get 10 different answers from those different parts. Even in my example of cost, if I looked at costs a few different ways, I could get some quite different answers. So how do I go about determining the weight that I give to each of those different answers? Whose values am I using in that? Do I decide, well, I'll go with quant because it's more empirical and qual's a bit more biased, but does that actually reflect the way the program works? Does that actually give me the level of understanding I need? So again, my values come into that. And then at the final point, when I'm starting to do the analysis and I'm writing recommendations, so I have a group of findings and I have to decide which I take forward to conclusions and which then I take forward to make recommendations on. And again, there's big value judgments in that. So along this pathway from the beginning to end, it's fraught with values, but we don't actually talk about the values at all.